Hey everyone, Kevin P. McAuliffe here for Rampant Design Tools, and I'm back again with another tutorial. And in this lesson, we're going to create the composite that you see in front of you. Now that background plate was something that I shot in about 3 seconds with my iPhone, and I did it that way intentionally because in many cases in the field you're given not so great footage to work with. And in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how inside of HitFilm Pro 2017 you can not only do a camera solve to get in and be able to add that text in perfectly with the background, but then what we're going to do is we're going to take this awesome element from the Studio Flares package and we're going to add it into our final composition to take our work to the next level. Now, one thing that I want to point out, and this is something I always like to mention about the Rampant Design Tools elements, is that for me, in most cases, what I like to call them is I like to call them the filling in the pie or the icing on the cake. They're those elements you add in there that might not necessarily be right in your face, but you can take them and add them to just about every shot in your production, and they're going to take your work to the next level. Now, what I want to do before we get started is I just want to head into Chrome and show you that inside of the Rampant Film and Light category at rampantdesigntools.com, if you scroll down, you're going to see that you have a whole bunch of fantastic elements to work with. And we're using the flares category, and as you can see, 531 flare elements to work with. That is quite an absolutely staggering amount of elements. And what I want you to do is I want you to head on over to 4kfree.com, sign up there to get the Rampant Design Tools newsletters that you're always going to get great, fantastic sales that Rampant Design Tools always has going on. And you're going to be able to download some of the elements from the flares package absolutely free. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into HitFilm Pro 2017 and let's get started. Alright, now before we go on, I do want to point out that we are using, again, much like I just mentioned, one of our Studio Flares effects. It's flare number 53. Now, the original version was 4K, but I'm only working in HD in this tutorial, so I'm only going to be using the HD version of it. Now, the reason that I chose this one was because I needed a flare that stayed relatively still in the frame. And this flare is perfect for that. You can actually notice right down at the bottom that this is actually playing right now, and this is going to work perfectly to attach to the upper left-hand corner of that text. All right, so let's now Command or Alt and Tab into HitFilm Pro 2017, and the first thing I'm going to do is to import our footage here from the desktop. And we want our Queen Street shot here. I'm going to take that, I'm going to drag it and drop it down into my timeline. You'll see that I'm prompted by HitFilm telling me that the timeline and the clip's frame rates don't match. So I always want to match the clip because it's the first clip I'm dragging down into the timeline. So I'm going to say yes. And what we're going to do with this shot, once we zoom in, you'll see it's about 6 seconds long, maybe just a little bit short of that. I'm going to right click on it and we're going to make a new composite shot out of it. Now, when we make the composite shot, we have the option when we're taking composite shot properties from the selected clip or the editor's sequence, or when we're taking effects and transformation properties, do we want to leave them here or move them with the clip? Now, for us, we don't have to worry about any of that because, to be honest, this clip has nothing on it. We haven't done anything to it. So anything that we're going to take, any properties we want is from the selected clip, and because we don't have any effects or transformation properties, we can leave them where they are. I'm simply going to say OK. Now, the reason I want to throw them into a composite shot is because I now have access to previewing inside of this window. Now, once we get this composite set up, we are going to need to preview it because we're going to have a lot of things going on at the same time. Okay, so let's now get in and let's set up our text. Now, to do that, we're going to need to do a camera solve. So what I want to do is I want to head to our Effects tab and I'm going to type in Mocha. And we're going to apply Mocha for HitFilm to our shot. Okay, now once we apply it, we're just going to twirl it down and I'm going to launch the Mocha user interface. Okay, now what we need to do at this point is we need to define a couple of planes in our shot. We want to define at least two. Now, what do I mean by a plane? Well, for example, the flat side of this building and the building beside it, that's one plane. The flat side of the building is going this way down the street. That's another plane. Conceivably, the street could be a plane. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to define these so that Mocha can do its best to extract the camera data from this shot to give us a realistic camera move. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to head up to the X-spline tool. I'm just going to draw an X-spline around this building here. It doesn't need to be perfect, just something that's going to define that plane just like that. And let's draw another one here on this plane over here. Luckily, the edge of the building and the top of the roof really make it easy to get in to define these planes. Okay. Now, the next thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make sure that we're tracking translation, scale, rotation, shear, and perspective. Now, because we're going to do a camera solve, I want to get as much information out of this shot as I can. So I'm going to change the minimum pixels used to be 90%. So it's basically Mocha's going to analyze 90% of the pixels inside of the areas that we have defined. Okay. Everything else we can leave the way it is, and I'm going to hit track. Okay. Now, once it starts tracking, you'll see that those splines we created are deadlocked into the building. Now, because this is going to take a little while, what I'm going to do is we're going to take a pause. I'm going to come back when the track is done, and I'm going to show you where we go from there. All right, so our track is now done. You'll see that as I drag down the timeline, those splines are locked onto the building. Now, to get a bit of a better idea of exactly what has happened, well, with this spline, what I should actually probably do first is I'm just going to call this right plane. Okay. And the next one we're going to call left plane. Okay. And we may as well start with the left plane since I already have it selected. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the planar surface here, and I'm going to set the planar surface up pretty much like I have the spline set up, kind of like that. So this way, when I turn on the planar grid, you actually get a pretty darn good idea of exactly what's happening with your track. Okay, and we could do the exact same thing with the right plane as well. Now I'm just going to turn both those parameters off. It's just a little bit easier. Actually, with just the grid turned off, it's just a little bit easier to see what you're doing. Kind of like this. So this way, when we turn that plane back on and we hit the space bar, you'll see again, pretty darn locked on as far as the track goes. Okay, so let's now get in, let's solve this camera information. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the camera solve module, which is right here. I'm not going to worry about the type of camera because I'm going to let Mocha figure that out for me. All I'm going to do is simply say solve, and once it's done, you'll see that I have a solve quality of 95%, and it's also told me the type of camera and the focal length associated with it. This is pretty darn good as far as a camera solve goes. So what's the next step now? Well, now what we're going to do is we're going to export that camera data. We are going to save it to the desktop, and I'm going to call this, appropriately enough, camera solve. Okay. I'm going to say save, and at this point we don't need to have Mocha open anymore, and I don't need to save the track I just did because all that information is saved in that camera solve file. What we're going to do now is right click, I'm going to come to import, and believe it or not, what we've actually saved out is a HitFilm composite shot. I'm just going to import the composite shot here of the camera solve. I'm going to say open. Now you'll notice that it simply calls the camera solve input. So what we're going to do is just right click, we're going to rename it. I'm going to call it camera solve, appropriately enough. Okay. And you'll now see that inside of the camera solve, where I had defined those planar regions, we now have the points actually associated with them inside of our composite shot. Okay. But what's really important for us is the camera here. So what we're going to do is just delete everything else. Okay. See you later. There we go. Okay. Now you'll notice that as I drag through, you'll see that the camera is moving because we can see the XY crosshairs moving. So let's get in, let's add some text. Okay. We're going to right click. We're going to add a new layer of text. I'm going to make this about 1920 by, let's make it by 480. Okay. And we're going to come to our text tool. I'm just going to type in Toronto rocks with 3 exclamation marks. We're going to select all of that text and we're going to head to our text panel. Let's come in, let's set the text type as impact, my favorite font. I'm just going to increase the font size to about 220. And let's now get in, center this up, and I'm going to add a little bit of a stroke around the edge. Now, our flare is blue, so why don't we sort of keep that idea, that color here. We'll just make our stroke blue as well. And let's now take our text and just increase its size a little bit. Okay, we're going to come to our controls, to our transform options. We're going to come to scale, just increase the size a bit, kind of like that. I don't want to make it too big in case the camera moves it off the screen. Now you'll notice that we still have the same problem we had before. The text isn't actually doing anything. Well, that's because I haven't placed this two-dimensional text into the 3D world of the camera. Okay, let's do that. What I'm going to do is navigate down to the layer dimensions and I'm going to switch it from 2D to 3D. Now you don't notice anything happen, but now you do. Okay, so there's our Toronto Rocks text, and all I'm going to do with this Toronto Rocks text is I'm going to head back to our main Queen Street composite layer. We're going to take our camera solve and I'm going to drag it and drop it down onto video layer number 2. It technically makes it video layer number 1 because it starts at the lowest and goes to highest, but what we now have is essentially an element that moves with the background. Now at any point I could preview this so we could take a look at it, but I'll wait till we add the lens flare in so that we can preview it all at one time. Okay, so let's now get in and let's put our flare into this shot. What we need to do again is to do another track. Okay, so with our camera solve layer selected, and what's important to keep in mind is that with this layer selected, technically it's on a transparent or a quote-unquote black background. So don't be surprised that when you have your camera solve clip and you come back to your effects, Mocha we're taking, you drag and drop it and you come back to the user interface, that the background is black. But you'll notice that this layer is moving around exactly the way that it needs to. And what I love is the fact that it's actually super responsive. You'll see it playing in real time inside of Mocha right here. Okay, so let's now come back. What I'm going to do is just define an area to track. I'm going to use the X-spline tool and I'm going to hold Z or Z for all my American friends on the keyboard to zoom in to a specific area or a specific range of my shot. I'm going to use the X key as the pan command. So these two keys you're going to use in conjunction with each other. Okay, and the area that we want to define is basically around the upper left hand corner of the T. So with the X-spline tool chosen, we're just going to draw a square just around. I don't need to make it this big. I think this is probably a little bit too big. Okay, let's just define this area here. We can tighten that up a bit. And what we're going to do, and you didn't see this when I was showing you how we set up the surface inside of the camera solve when we were setting up the camera solve, is that when we set up the planar surface, what you might not have noticed is that there's actually a little crosshairs right in the middle that we can use to define as the center point for a center point track. Now we're still doing planar tracking inside of Mocha, but we're going to be able to use that planar surface as center point to define a location for our lens flare to be attached to. Okay, so let's now come in. I don't need to track 90%. I think that's going a bit overboard. Let's track 40%, and I'm only going to track translation because, to be honest, I really only care in a flat 2D space where it's going to be positioned in X and Y space. Okay, let's zoom back a little bit. We'll just center this up just so we can see what our track is going to do. Okay, let's come in. I'm going to hit track forward. And you'll see that not only does it track super fast when it's tracking only translation, but again, this track is locked dead on to our footage. Okay. And once it's done, there we go. What we're going to do is come back to the beginning here. Again, I'm going to zoom in, Z or Z on the keyboard, pan with X. Okay. Let's call up our planar surface. Now you can kind of see it here if you look carefully. There it is right there, the center point of our planar surface. And what I want to do is place it as close to the upper left hand side as I can. Okay, and this is doing a pretty good job right about there. Now the real test is not just on the first frame, it's when I jump down to the halfway point and we just pan the shot over and you'll see pretty much dead center. Jump down again, you'll see again pretty much dead center. Now I think I'm just going to actually move it over a little bit here. Let's pan this here. Okay, and let's just bring it down a little bit, just because I'd actually prefer that it sits a little bit on the text. Okay, let's just check what it's doing. Looking good. Looking good. Okay, I think we're in good shape now. Okay, so now that we're at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to export our tracking data. And instead of doing a corner pin export, which we're going to talk about in an upcoming lesson, I'm just going to do a standard transform data position, scale, and rotation, meaning it's going to be looking at this center point for all of that information. Okay, let's say save. We're going to save this to the desktop. I'm going to call it lens flare track. And again, we can close Mocha. Don't need to save anything. We'll say don't save. And let's import our shot. We're going to come back to import. Again, exactly the same as before, a composite shot. We're going to bring in our lens flare track. Again, right click, rename, call it lens flare track. Now there's a couple ways that we can attach this flare inside of our lens flare track. First thing, again, much like before, is we're going to delete our plane layer, and you'll notice that if I click on the point layer, there's all the information for our track, for our center point. Let's now take our lens flare. I'm going to drag it and drop it into this composite shot. Once it's here, there's a couple ways that we can get this information from here, from our layer. You'll see that if I twirl that down, there's all the position keyframe information. I can actually take this if I wanted to and copy it, and I can come up to the lens flare and I can come down to the transform data to the position, and I can paste that information down just like that. Now this does lead to a little bit of a problem that if you're looking closely, you're going to be able to see in the frame. Okay, I'm just going to pan the frame. You'll notice that the lens flare is not centered right in the middle of the XY value. The reason that is because in the original shot, the lens flare is not exactly perfectly centered. That's one of, believe it or not, that's one of the advantages of working with these very organic elements, is that they're not perfect and you don't want them to be. So in this case, I probably wouldn't apply the lens flare tracking data like that. I'm just going to undo what I just did, and whoops, I took it a little bit too far. Let's just take our lens flare and place it back into our shot here. I'm just going to zoom back. Actually, let's just scale this to fit, and I'm going to position this element manually. So let's just grab our layer here. I'm going to put it right up about there. I've almost got it. I think we're probably pretty darn close. Okay. And I think we're good. I think I'm happy with that right there. I don't need to get into be too specific. Okay, now that we've got our shot where we want it, it's a little bit too big. So let's come to our element. We're going to twirl it down, come to our transform data. We're just going to scale it down. Now, something else that it's very important for me to mention is that for us to combine this element into our composite, I need to use an additive or a screen transfer mode. Now the only, I'm not going to say problem, but the issue with these two transfer modes is that for an element to be transparent, the background needs to be black. Now as you'll notice right here, our background does not ever really go completely to black. This is actually a very dark blue. So what we need to do is we need to get in and we need to mask this shot a little bit. Okay, now what I should do is before we're happy with the position of this, I'm just going to bring it over a bit so we can do our mask. I'm just going to grab our pen tool, and again, we're going to be pretty loose on this, nothing too crazy. Okay, we'll place that one about there, rotate it around. Okay, and again, like I said, we're keeping it kind of fast and loose here. There we go. What I'm also going to do once that mask is there is we're just going to twirl down the shape. I'm just going to feather it a little bit. There we go. Okay, and now we need to reline up our flare with our tracking points. Now, many people think you just need to select the layer to do that, but you'll notice that as soon as I select it, I don't see those points. The reason being is that that's because I have the pen tool chosen and not the selection tool. Okay, so you can see I just got to move it over and up a little bit. So nothing too crazy. A little bit farther over, and I think we're pretty much good to go. All right, so let's now switch back to our composite. Let's take our lens flare track. Let's drag that, drop that down onto the topmost layer. Doesn't quite look right because we haven't set our transfer mode yet. Okay, now let's set the transfer mode by with the layer selected. We're going to come to the controls. I'm going to come to the layer properties, and I'm going to switch the blend from normal to additive. Now that's looking like a really cool lens flare. Now there was something that I didn't do that we're going to do right now. Let me come back to my lens flare track. You'll notice that of course now the flare is still not tracking because we didn't parent it to the proper layer, which is layer number 1. All I'm going to do is drop down the parent drop down. I'm going to select layer 1, and now this tracks just like it should. Okay, let's come back to our Queen Street composite. You'll see we're all set to go. What I'm going to do is give this a preview, and we'll be back in 1 second to show you what the final composite looks like. All right, we're back. Our preview's done. All I'm going to do is come back and hit play, and you'll see that our Toronto Rocks looks like it's actually part of this shot sitting over top of Queen Street in Toronto with that lens flare locked onto the upper left-hand corner. And I love the fact that we have our bright sunset on the left-hand side almost shooting down the street. The lens flares coming off the blue on the edge of Toronto Rocks and causing this lens flare which was a great practical element from Rampant Design Tools, so you can see how you can combine great practical elements with a little bit of thinking on your part to create some very cool composites inside of HitFilm Pro 2017. Alright, now don't forget, if you want some great free 4K elements, head on over and check them out at 4kfree.com, and to check out the entire Rampant Design Tools product line, you can head on over and check them out at rampantdesigntools.com.